Hey everyone, it's Carl, and I am a proponent of Savage Worlds, if you haven't noticed on this channel. And so I try to bring new players in all the time. And one of the biggest groups of new players are D&D players. Now, Savage Worlds and D&D are different games, and there's some things in Savage Worlds that if you're a GM or you're a new player coming in, you need to think about because you could kind of get screwed up. I'm stuck in a D&D game, all the tropes are the same. And my armor in a 10-foot pole. Hey everyone, it's Carl with Tabletop Tango. I'd love it if you look at the bubbles, do the stuff, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff, and even support just for fun. So what are the things that a D&D player coming to Savage Worlds is going to get kind of confused or tripped up with, and really shouldn't do these kinds of things? So let's start off. First off, and I've talked about this before, is Savage Worlds is not an attrition system. D&D has hit points. You keep whittling down those hit points, and a higher level player could have like 100 hit points or 50 hit points. And so smaller creatures just kind of whittle that down, and you can just wade into combat and it's all good. But in Savage Worlds, you have 3 wounds, and those wounds are caused by when an opponent who is attacking you can get over your toughness, which is a vigor based stat, and your armor. If they get over high enough, they could do plenty of wounds. And if you can't do a thing called soaking, which can remove some wounds, you could be incapacitated just like that. So there's a saying kind of in the Savage Worlds community that says even a peasant with a pitchfork can take out a hero in Savage Worlds. That's different than D&D. So D&D, you're used to being a hero, just wade in, crush through all the little guys. In Savage Worlds, a lucky roll and the little guy can take you out. Second thing, powers in Savage Worlds are more generic than in Dungeons and Dragons. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you have lists and lists and lists of spells, just tons of them. There's whole books written with new spells that you can use. Savage Worlds, there's a limited set of spells, and the reason for that is trappings are what's important. So you can have what's called a bolt, which is essentially could be a magic missile, could be Melf's acid arrow, could be an ice shot, it could be it could be a lot of things, but it's all about the trappings, whether it's electrical, fire, whatever. And those can affect the damage, but in the end, the power is the power. And you trap it and you name it. That's another cool thing is, based on your character and your concept, you get to name your power to be something that's specific to you. And you get to add those trappings that make sense to you. And in some cases, those trappings will affect and add on. So if your trapping is some kind of fire, and something is combustible, your game master is going to allow maybe that to start on fire. So again, powers are more generic. There's not that many compared to Dungeons and Dragons, but it's all about how you trap them. And the one power actually represents multiple powers that you might see in D&D. The third thing, there's so much more combat options in Savage Worlds. I've watched D&D folks play. I've played D&D, and there's a lot of, I swing my sword, I hit the thing. I did some damage. Next round, I swing my sword, do the thing. Or I can use my bonus action to do something. Savage Worlds, there's so much that you can do. You have the idea of multi-actions, so true multi-action. So you can decide to do 2 things, or you can decide to do one thing and then another that's completely different. You have the idea of support and test, which allows somebody who's not as combat effective to taunt an opponent, to do something that kind of screws the opponent up so that they become vulnerable to your party's attack, or they become distracted and can't attack as well as they'd like to. And that's all done without, possibly even using a weapon, right? That spellcaster in the back of the party who in D&D with this little dagger is really combat ineffective if he's not throwing powers around or spells around, can actually, if he's got the right scores, he can try to taunt, or he can try to, throw something at that. Maybe he says, oh, I pick up a rock and I'm throwing it at his feet to see if he slips. Okay, what's your throwing? So what's your athletics? Can you throw that there? And what does he do against that from a test perspective? So there's a lot of stuff you can do. And then there's ways to add in, you want to do a wild attack, you open yourself up, but then you also on the backside are more vulnerable to another attack to you. Do you want to aim and spend some time so you get a bonus? Do you want to do a called shot and shoot at the hand, knock the gun out, or maybe shoot at the head and get bonus damage Or they got armor and there's a tiny little slit. I can actually try to shoot through that slit at a big penalty, -6, but I might be able to do it. And that's a combat option. It's not all hit, do damage, hit, do damage. There's a lot that you can do. The next thing is the hit and damage system. So I did a whole video on that piece of the game, but it's important to know as a D&D player, you're used to opponents having an armor class. If I get over that armor class, that difficulty, and I hit them, there is an expectation, unless they have some kind of immunity or something like that, but let's set that aside, or damage reduction or something. But I expect I'm going to do some damage. Now, this creature could have, 50 hit points, and I'm doing 6 points of damage at a time, but I'm doing a little bit of damage every time. It goes back to that attrition system I talked about earlier. In Savage Worlds, you need to get past either just a target number 4 for a ranged weapon or the parry of your opponent in a melee combat. If you do that, there is really no guarantee you're doing damage, because then you roll your damage and that goes against your opponent's toughness, which includes armor values, includes the vigor stat divided by 2 plus 2. All that gets added in, and that you have to get over. So you might, quote unquote, hit, but if you don't do enough damage to get over that toughness, you're not going to shake them, you're not going to wound them. And that's a hard one sometimes for people to grasp. What I tell game masters is it's all one action. It isn't like I hit them, but I didn't do any damage. It's all one thing. I roll a hit, but I didn't do any damage. So there's possibility it was a glancing blow. It's a possibility that he stepped out of the way just as my sword came down. Wait until it's all taken care of, all of it. And then that defines what happened in that kind of round of combat as you're going after the bad guy. The next thing is initiative. D&D players are used to rolling a die, adding their bonuses, and then that's it. Every round, that's where you go. That's just the way it is. In Savage Worlds, you have a playing card deck that you deal a card out to each player every round of combat. And then that goes from jokers and high cards all the way down to low cards with the reverse order of the naming of the suits. And that gets redealed every time. And if somebody gets a joker, they can go at any time they want. If you're at the top of the round and you don't want to do something yet, you can go on hold and wait for you to get a chance. Like somebody else moves, well, then you can interrupt them. So from an action economy standpoint, and I did a video on action economy too, you can really plan and have a lot of strategy, but you also have to think about what's going on. You can't say, I was first in this round, I did some real, if I get ahead of him in the next round, I'm going to just take him out, it's going to be, well, he might get ahead of you in the next round. So you have to think, you have to plan, you have to think of how things are going to go. And it makes it kind of exciting, to be honest. Plus, you don't get to be that guy who rolled, on a D20 of 3, and you just wait till get hammered, and you get to do your thing, and then you just wait till get hammered. There's always a chance you're going to be ahead of the game the next round. And with, like I said, with holding, you can now do things like at the end of the round, if I'm last, but I want to see what's going on, I can go on hold. Maybe I'm not ready to do something. And then that ramps around to the next round. So you're on hold going into the next round, and then you're allowed to interrupt somebody maybe, or decide when you're going to go in that round after somebody else goes. You can go then because you were on hold all the way through. So a lot of flexibility, a lot of interest. There's edges that add to, how many cards you get. It's kind of cool. And then you can also throw a Benny and get a new initiative card. So just getting your chance to go in initiative is a strategy piece of the game in and of itself. It's not just this, I don't know, I'd call it an afterthought almost. It's just this kind of basic, let's just get everything going, and now we're going to rip through it constantly. Something to keep in mind. Savage Worlds can be more deadly, but is it really? So, folks who play D&D 5e, maybe not so much D&D 1e. When I was playing, you had things like save or die, and you're kind of wimpy and things just took you out. Okay, but in 5th edition, there's a lot of ways to stay alive with saving throws and multiple. People say Savage Worlds is much more deadly because you have the exploding dice and you have only 3 wounds. But the reality is you can soak wounds and spend those bennies to soak. You have to, when you get incapacitated, There's rolls that you make before you just die, and then somebody can come and stop you from bleeding out just with a healing check, even if they're not like a spell cast or anything like that. So Savage Worlds can be more deadly, but the reality is no matter how many wounds you do, you're literally just going to be incapacitated. So any one healing can bring you back. So it can be deadly, but as a D&D player, don't use that as an excuse to say I'm not going to do something in combat, or I'm not going to put myself out there because I'm worried about that. And then the last thing is bennies. Bennies are fundamentally not in D&D. There's the idea of, you can use, I forget the name of it, but that gives you like inspiration, I think is, and you can get bonus die and stuff like that. D&D, in Savage Worlds, you have bennies, and bennies can be spent to reroll trait rolls. It can be spent to reroll damage. It can be spent to get a new initiative card. They can be spent to kind of affect the narrative of the game. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with bennies. What I'm cautioning D&D players who come into the game system is you start with 3 bennies as a wild card, which is what you are as a player. You're called a wild card. Sometimes they just like throw those bennies and throw them, and before you know, you're out of bennies. And even a game master who's got a pretty robust what we call benny economy, and they're throwing them out, you can quickly get yourself in a heap of problem because you won't be able to soak those wounds because you won't have a benny for it. You won't be able to make those rolls that you think are absolute critical because you've spent all your bennies already. So there's things that you got to think about. You've got this new tool that's pretty cool, but it's a strategy to that too. I like people spending bennies for sure and keep the benny economy going, but I still recognize that if you're new to the game, you may be making those decisions and you may be using all your bennies without the insight of why you're doing that. So if you get a notice roll, maybe it's not important. So maybe not spend the benny every time you think there's something you really want to be successful at. There's the whole idea of failing forward, and failing can be fun. So, have fun failing. It's not all about being the hero and always winning. Sometimes you get kicked back and that's what happens. So remember, not an attrition system. Powers are more generic. Combat options are greater to think about. The hit and damage system's fundamentally different. Initiative, every round, using the cards, lots of things you can do. Can be more deadly because there's only 3 wounds, but in reality, I don't think it is. And then finally, bennies. We love bennies, and there's so many cool things you can do with them. Just don't go crazy. Think about how you're going to use them and what can be done the best with them. Okay? So anyway, this was Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff, really would appreciate it. Definitely would like to subscribe and the likes and the notification ringing the bell. That would be much cooler than, any financial support, at least to me, I think. So anyway, thank you much, and we'll catch you later. Bye now.